Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Baer, and we have guest Peter Robbins with us today from peterrobbinsny.com. Now, Peter is an investigative writer, author, and lecturer, best known for his information on UFOs, and Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Now, during this discussion, not only do we discuss the research that Peter has put together over the past 35 years on the UFO phenomenon, but also during the second half of the show, we dive into Dr. Wilhelm Reich, his work, the Orgone energy accumulators that he built and was ridiculed for by Big Pharma and many large corporations and top scientists because they were afraid it was going to take away what they had built, essentially, because these things were so powerful. And also, we talk about these cloud busters that Dr. Reich used to put together that has some pretty powerful consequences on the environment. So some pretty good stuff. I would recommend listening to the entire presentation. If you want to know more about the Orgone energy accumulators and the cloud busters, definitely listen to the second half of the show. During the first half, we discuss his work with the United Nations. He worked with the House of Parliaments in the UK. So he's had some pretty prestigious positions, and he definitely knows his stuff. Over 30 years of research into the field of UFOs and Dr. Wilhelm Reich. So this is a good presentation. I hope you enjoy the show. Make sure to subscribe to youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. We also have a new YouTube channel. It's the William Wallace YouTube channel. So, I actually was doing some research, and I noticed that you've actually worked with the UN before.
Well, yes, indirectly. In fact, my very first, I'll call it a job, even though it was unpaid, and this goes back more than 35 years. I was several years into the work, and one of my mentors, long gone now, a remarkable guy who had served on the general staff of the Hungarian military during World War II, one of the world's best photo analysts at the time, Koman von Kavetsky. He's a naturalized American citizen and had a relationship with two United Nations Secretaries General, Uthant and Kurt Waldheim. And it was under the tenure of Waldheim that the United Nations had a brief, open discussion on whether or not they should make the subject of UFOs a permanent study issue as an aspect of General Assembly. And he had invited myself and my earliest contemporary colleague in the field, Antonio Huneeus, to work on editing the paper that he had written for Waldheim to be presented at that historic series of meetings. And this was in November of 1978. So although it was presented at the UN, I was not working for the UN at the time. Some of my most distinguished colleagues, though, Stanton Friedman, Jacques Vallée, Dr. Alan Hynek, were present and were speakers at the time, as well as an extraordinarily important military witness, Lawrence Coyne, who was an Army helicopter. Trying to remember whether he was a pilot or an officer, but he was involved in one of the most dramatic UFO events ever documented. He presented as well, as did Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, on the reality of UFOs. Unfortunately, Cooper's statement had to be read into the record because he was not able to get to New York. The city had been kind of locked in by a blizzard the day before. But it was an amazing experience for me to sit up in the gallery and watch how the representatives chose not to deal with this subject. One had the sense, watching their faces and their reactions, that they would have rather been, called to a resolution of war rather than be compelled to go back to their leadership and say we need to take UFOs seriously. I mean, these guys valued their cushy jobs in New York and their nice apartments and good salaries, and the ridicule factor has no limits in terms of who it extends to. I should say also that the resolution was passed and then allowed to die in committee, and that was the last we've ever heard from the UN relative to this subject. Not a nice commentary.
Well, and haven't the United Nations recently appointed, I want to pronounce her name properly, Moslin Othman? She's into astrophysics from Malaysia as the ambassador for outer space affairs, essentially?
I believe so. But and one would imagine that if such a resolution were ever brought up again, or the issue of UFOs was ever to come under United Nations purview or review, that it would be his group that it would come under. As things stand right now, to the best of my knowledge, nothing relative to that subject has come up. It's much more concerned with what we'll call conventional outer space issues at this point.
So the media probably took that, and they can spin it in a numerous amount of ways. And then I'm wondering if the UN kind of did that as a PR stunt, a campaign essentially to create a certain buzz with the masses.
It wouldn't surprise me. The fact is that it's a subject that is such a flashpoint for fascination and ridicule. One can imagine official bodies being pulled in both directions. For example, Her Majesty's government in Great Britain years ago began to declassify UFO documents, then stopped, then did it again, and I think we're going to be having a new spate of them soon. Quite a few thousand documents were, in fact, declassified. Not surprisingly, all low or mid-level documents, no smoking gun, but some interesting smoke. And it had occurred to many of us at the time that it was both a smart public relations move, that if there was some real sincerity behind it, it was, step number one in laying out some background material for those interested who, might want to learn a little more. Again, it stops at a very specific level. But as far as I'm concerned, anything is better than nothing. So good for Great Britain on that.
And then also, if you go to, there's FBI.gov, it's vault.fbi.gov, you can actually pull up, I guess, some of those papers you're referring to, or a few of them anyway, some referring to the Roswell incident in 1950, a gentleman by the name, or I guess his code name was Guy Hotel or Hostel or something like that. And he
no code name. That was his real name. He was a special agent in charge. I'm trying to remember whether it was in Washington or not. Many people think that particular series of cables are fake or in some way not authentic. In fact, they are. If you've read them, you know that they read like some exciting science fiction script excerpt, and they were actually declassified before we had a Freedom of Information Act in this country, which came in under President Carter. In fact, the way that it had worked, I don't know how it is anymore, that documents that had been considered classified would be reviewed every 3 years, and after a 12-year cycle, if they were considered not crucial to the security of the United States, they would be quietly declassified and placed appropriately in the National Archives, where in some cases they were discovered by researchers and investigators. I think they're terribly important. They're a remarkably significant footnote to post-war history, and yet, unless you're really into the subject, folks don't even know they exist.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I'm reading the article right now, and I'm at the office memorandum, and it's from 1950, and it says that he saw 3 beings in each craft. They were about 3 feet tall, and they had like a metallic cloth of fine texture. Now, I've heard different theories about this. I've heard the theory that they were prisoners of war, and they were actually being used as some type of experiment. And
I've certainly heard that as well. And again, Hottel is reporting what a witness saw. He is not saying, I saw this. But having studied Roswell fairly extensively, not to the degree that some of my very specialist research colleagues have, but also having the privilege of working as a consultant to the city of Roswell for more than 2 years and acting as their liaison at the time between the mayor's office and Governor Richardson's office on matters that were related to UFOs. I educated myself that much more to the subject. I think ultimately if you can't present, a carburetor from a UFO or an appendix from an alien or what have you, it's always going to be kind of a he said, she said sort of thing, and people will believe either what they want to believe or maybe more accurately what they can tolerate believing. But I am convinced that the evidence is overwhelming in support of the crash of a truly anomalous craft well outside the town limits of then the town of Roswell in the summer of 1947.
Now, you've been doing research on UFOs, ETs, the paranormal for about 35 years or so, right?
A bit more, yeah. Primarily the UFO subject in general and its implications for humanity. And when I say UFO, Rex, let me just clarify. I think, like a lot of folks in the field, that many, if not most, and possibly the majority of quote-unquote UFO reports are, in fact, explainable in conventional terms. More so now even than when the phenomena kicked in, so-called modern age of UFOs began in 1947. The reason being that we human beings and first world governments have things up in our skies that are so advanced, black budget projects, that they mimic what the behavior of the truly anomalous objects, whether or not, as some maintain, that they are the result of back engineering, to use the popular phrase of crashed UFOs, remains to be seen. I used to have sort of a running discussion with my friend and another mentor, Bud Hopkins, over the years that we were colleagues, about this very subject. Bud always felt that we human beings, at our best, are capable of anything, really. And the big question is, could we have gotten from there to here on our own? There being, going back to the post-war years, the age of tube radios, pre-transistor, piston-driven machines that move things from here to here, to where we seem to be now, complete with the internet and everything we have going on in space. Just for me, contemplating the abilities of an average smartphone. I'm not a computer person, and I have, I'm lost in terms of my awe for the technology. Could we have created those on our own? I think we may well have. Would I be surprised if I learned that all of this whole new age of technology that we live with every day and take for granted was the result of a breakthrough in back engineering of off-planet technology? Not at all. I wouldn't be surprised. My issue comes with people who impose their beliefs or their longings on what may be and state it as empirical fact. If somebody tells you that, yes, all of our modern technology is the result of back engineering of UFOs, I would ask them to present what evidence they have in that, rather than what speculation or what leaked communications from an undisclosed source, or all the other very dramatic ways that people have of taking positions in this work.
Well, one thing I've definitely noticed with specific topics such as the UFO phenomena and other anomalies, matter of fact, many subjects, even global warming, I was talking about this the other day. You've got one side of the coin where people will say global warming is all caused by us. And then the other side of the coin, you're going to have people that are going to say, we have absolutely nothing to do with any type of environmental change. We can pillage the earth as much as we want, and it doesn't matter. And I really think there's somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? I think that we have an effect on the environment, and I also feel that there's outer influences of the environment as well, from where we're located in the universe and the sun and everything else. So I feel
that the earth goes through its long cycles as well. And then there are those people who maintain there is no climate change going on and everything is just fine. Climate deniers, so to say. And you're right. We don't know for sure. My feeling is that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, we have been pouring countless tons and tons of coal dust and other toxicities into our atmosphere to such a degree that it has had an effect, a serious effect on where we stand now. I think that some folks, and I would include some of my fundamentalist brothers and sisters in this, feel that's not possible because it's just too big. Only God could have done that, or a much more outsider, not an outsider, a not take responsibility position.
Yeah, absolutely. And even I was looking at some of the charts with all of the different chemicals in the waters and around the world. It's
Oh
absolute
God,
fact that we've
yeah,
affected the earth. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole other subject and
it
such.
is.
And I'm glad that we're on the same page with that. Now,
Yeah.
when you also worked with Parliament.
Well, once again, I didn't work with them. I was once again an editor on a position paper that was presented before a special committee within the British Parliament, and this goes back to 1980. And that was a more serious discussion of the subject than the United Nations had had 2 years earlier. Again, working for Coleman von Kavetsky on that, it was his paper. And I should take a moment to say that one of his major points, which was absolutely visionary and I think still something of concern, was that, let's just say, that a truly anomalous UFO, or a series of them, entered the airspace of some first world nuclear-armed country, Russia, America would be my two first thoughts, and was not identified as such, as a enemy or as a earthbound, not identified as a UFO and seen instead as the first wave of an attack coming from, their big enemy. His feeling as a military scientist was that there was a chance that codes could be processed and the button could be pushed and a nuclear strike could happen, which would be not just a terrible world-changing tragedy, but completely based on erroneous facts. So I thought it was a very thoughtful subject and one that I was happy to lend my efforts to.
Now, I've also heard some, possibilities with the ETs and these UFO craft using like an anti-gravity technology. Have you found any links to the tech that has been referred to with them, that kind of what we're using now? Or, I mean, do you believe in that kind of stuff?
Oh, I think, again, I think technologically, literally anything is possible if you have the wherewithal, the team, and the vision, and the knowledge to put it together. I believe there's technology out there that we normal civilians are certainly not aware of that has been harnessed. As far as anti-gravity technology, sure, why not? At the same time, I would say that I have not seen proof of this, simply allegations that run from, internet speculation to fairly respectful and respectable scientific theories around the subject. But to say, yes, that's true, would be completely misleading of me. I answer so many questions with the phrase, I don't know, because I don't know. And again, people in this field, we don't have any overriding governing body to, like the AMA for physicians or the bar for lawyers, to chastise or come down on practitioners who, are full of hot air or who are putting things into the public record as fact that's simply their idea of what is fact, or their belief, or their wish, or their longing, or even their fear. Hence, when I hear people refer to, the treaty that Eisenhower made with the aliens in 1954, or the fight below Dulce, New Mexico, where 287 American troops were killed by aliens, I go into a real eyeball roll. I mean, come on, give me a break. I'm not saying that these things or these kinds of things are impossible or did not happen. I'm saying that stating them as fact is completely false and completely irresponsible.
Something interesting about Phil Schneider is most people that have researched into what he talks about in the YouTube videos where he comes out and says he has ET tech and he got his fingers blown off from some aliens underground, it's got a pretty big following. A lot of people really believe that. And I've been out to Dulce, New Mexico, and I had an opportunity to get somebody escorted me about 2/3 of the way up the mountain, the Archuleta Mesa, and it was pretty steep and intense, and I didn't have a spare tire to go all the way up to the top in case I was going to get a flat tire, so I finally said, hey, maybe I better turn around. Mm-hmm. And the guy that took me up there, he lives out there. He's got a really cool position in Dulce. He says that he's seen some anomalies at the top before, like these lights that came and hovered over for half an hour. I talked to a lot of locals. They said they've seen stuff.
It is an area with a very high incidence of UFO sightings, but to say that seeing interesting lights or clocking genuine UFOs is the same as, the famous, fantastic, and in my mind, completely unproven battle under Dulce is nonsense. The other thing, you said it has a pretty big following. I think Kim Kardashian has 16 million Twitter followers. People love this stuff, and they love the romance and the drama of it. And the heck with the facts. I like the speculation, and I met somebody who said they knew, and I saw this cool video, and it's very, very important to parse the information in this field. I sometimes irritate people because I am so pedantic about this is what I know and could prove in a court of law. This is what I'm absolutely sure of, but do not have the evidence to back up. This is what I think. This is what I believe. This is what I fear. This is what may be, as opposed to, oh, well, I have a good reputation in this work, and if I say it, a lot of people will take it seriously. So part of my responsibility is to not say things that are irresponsible or that I think may be true as true. And I wish that everybody in the field follow that line of thinking.
That's awesome, Peter. And I was actually, the reason I brought up the big following is because I was going to add to that. Since I've been doing the Leak Project now for a little over a year, I've gotten a lot of emails and testimonies, and somebody actually sent me an email that said they did a lot of research into Phil Schneider, and they said that he was into self-mutilation and making up stories, and that he had met the family and talked to them, and they had said that, what he had talked about seemed like it wasn't true. And so I wondered, I was like, okay, so is this guy sending me this email, is he legit, or is he sending me this as disinformation? And I don't know either. I take a stance as agnostic on many things that I don't know. I look at the evidence, and I try and take a neutral stance towards things. I'm emotional just like anybody else, and I have my own opinions, but I try and leave them to myself oftentimes, unless I kind of go off on tangents, which I often do, but not during these interviews. So, but this is incredible. The 35 years that you've been doing this research, more than 35 years, could you give our listeners some gems that would make them sit back and go, that's incredible?
Ooh, I would have to say that since the 1970s, especially in the years that I worked as Bud Hopkins' assistant, and I should say here for any listeners who are not familiar with his name, you should be. Bud was one of our most outstanding individuals in the field. We lost him 5 years ago this month to cancer, but we were friends for 35 years, and for probably close to half that time, I worked very closely with him. He was arguably the father of the scientific study of what I find the most complex and troubling subtopic within the UFO field, namely abductions. And with him, I certainly pursued several hundred cases of people who very definitely seemed to have been taken and returned and had a history of it. Two cases that spring to mind that I will never forget, both of them thankfully embodied in two of Bud's finest books, is the case of Debbie Jordan, that is her real name, a lovely regulation issue person living in not Ohio, Indiana, who had a lifetime history of these abductions, and the evidence to support it in terms of other witnesses, physical evidences, the electricity going off during to her whole neighborhood when people saw UFOs hovering over the house, a huge burn mark in the backyard where one of these craft touched down, where nothing grew for years, is all available in Bud's book, Intruders. If anything, an even more extraordinary event, and I think certainly a centerpiece in abduction studies, is the so-called Linda case involving a woman, Linda Corteil, that last name is a pseudonym, who still lives in the same neighborhood she grew up in Lower Manhattan, who also had a history of being taken and returned, and was taken in 1989 at about 2 in the morning. However, dozens of people. I mean, it's New York City, and even if it's a quiet night, early in the morning, there are lots of people up and about and working or doing whatever they're doing. We don't know how many people observed her being floated literally through the plate glass window of her 12th floor apartment that had a view, she's still there, a view of the Brooklyn Bridge, and through another window, poignantly, a view of the Old Trade Center. And several beings curled up, Linda in her nightgown, and going right into the bottom of a large glowing disc shape, which then took off and dove into the East River. Now, I know how that sounds, but once we began to work that case, and people were aware that Bud was looking into it, we received dozens of letters from people all over the area who had observed it from one point or another, the Brooklyn Bridge or the FDR Drive or just downtown in general. And the basic reaction was, I thought they were making a movie. And the thing that was especially compelling to us, both of us as trained artists, was one person after another, all of them not artists, included drawings, colored pencil, crayon, whatever, showing the same damn craft with the same color combinations, all of the time frames dovetailed. It's also important to note that absolutely no one who contacted Bud about this, most of them allowed this information to be used in the book, some didn't. Nobody was looking for fame or fortune. Nobody wanted a penny for it. Nobody was interested in becoming a public person on it, which is important. If somebody, contacts you with the same information and says, I'd like $100 or $1,000 or whatever, for my contribution, they're certainly entitled to ask, but all of a sudden there's a profit motive, and there was not here. We worked that case for 6 years, and it resulted in the publication of a book called Witnessed, The True Story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO Abductions. Both of these books are available in used copies you can pick up for a couple of bucks each online, and I would certainly encourage readers to, your listeners to read them. An extraordinary case I will never forget is one that resulted in the publication of a book that, for better or worse, I'm well known for, namely Left at East Gate, which is an investigation into Great Britain's best known and best documented UFO incident, which I wrote with one of the witnesses, an American Air Force security police officer who was directly involved, named Larry Warren, which also is available in print or out-of-print editions. And that is a case that, even though it's 36 years old now, is still drawing great controversy, new evidence coming up, and an ongoing debate about aspects of it. There's so many. I guess, we could almost spend the whole rest of the time going over potential cases, but I'll give you another one. Some years ago, I was invited to speak for a local MUFON affiliate here in the Northeast. I'll keep it fairly general. MUFON being the Mutual UFO Network, the largest UFO research organization in the world, and I should say they are having their international yearly symposium at the end of this month in Orlando, and I hope maybe some of your listeners will join me there. I'll be hosting it as the MC. And I had been told, and this was an area with a number of, we'll call them out abductees, people who were not concerned about ridicule and were quite public about it, that there was one man that I really had to meet who had a long history of this, but one particular event that set him apart. I was taken to his home. We met first when he came to my talk and established some kind of rapport. An extremely nice, very down-to-earth gentleman, an engineer, very pragmatic, married to a nurse. They lived in a very nice home in farm country, and their backyard was essentially a very large farmer's field, and it had to be at least 100 yards behind that there was forest. And comings and goings had happened to him since he was a kid. However, one night he was sleeping on his stomach, I should say, and an abduction scenario began. He began to levitate off his bed and move up. This had happened to him repeatedly in his life. And again, it sounds like bad science fiction, but folks, this is the way it is. He would normally have been floated through the ceiling and the roof and been taken and then later returned, the same way that Linda was floated through a plate glass window 12 stories up and multiply witnessed. However, as his body kind of entered the ceiling, I don't know how else to say it, something happened, something that we have no other record of. Namely, the scenario stopped. A switch was turned off, something broke, something didn't happen that was supposed to, and with part of his back, some percentage of an inch, already integrated with the plaster ceiling, he fell back onto the bed, and in the process tore a piece of flesh out of his back. His wife, a practical nurse again, rushed him to the emergency room where he was treated, and I honestly don't remember what they told the attending physician when they were asked how this weird injury happened. I mean, what can one say? Again, I have to say my take on his character, 100%. Modest, self-effacing, not looking for glory or attention in this, no money. Somebody who I felt was completely without guile, who would never have attested to something that was not true. I visited him at home, and as low-key a home as any I've ever been to, everything nice and orderly. But like many individuals who have had these experiences, it's accompanied by missing time, where you cannot account for a period of time, and you wake up, your last memory is at point A, and your next memory is at point B, and an hour and a half have passed, and you're 50 miles away, or a likely similar scenario. And many abductees I know have met with, consider friends, some of them of decades now, have an understandable obsession with time. And while we were talking, in his living room, I found myself glancing around. It was kind of an open floor plan. And I thought, isn't this interesting? I noticed no less than 8 clocks that I could see from where I was. And I will say here, they were not clock collectors. The house was filled with clocks. And, in and of itself, it means nothing. Accompanied by this other information and more, it is indicative of somebody that has had this happen. That's a very tiny representative sampling. I'm investigating a situation right now, investigation incomplete, but also finding some rather breathtaking anomalies that are variations on the hundreds of investigations that I've conducted over the decades.
And I've talked to people before that have had a lot of hypnosis regression sessions with people, and I think it was Dr. Jacobs that referred to his cases, and he says that most people he talks to, they're just, when they get abducted, they're like helping ETs and hybrids deal with regular life so they don't get hit by a car when walking across the street, essentially. And then I've talked to people that I know personally that have much different versions of what happens to them. Like they're very almost... They feel like they're taking a piece of them every time they get abducted, essentially. Not just physically, but almost mentally and spiritually as well. And, what have you found as far as the different cases? Have you noticed that there's a multitude of extraterrestrials or descriptions?
Well, it's a great question, Rex. First of all, let's begin with the understanding that although, for me, the most logical and, in an ironic way, most conservative explanation for where these other intelligences come and go from is somewhere out there, which would classify them as extraterrestrial. But that is still, we don't know it absolutely 100%, although I would put money on the fact that certainly that is a very likely possibility for some of them. But yes, people report very different experiences, and that goes from the sublime to the terrifying. Number one, I have to say, and I don't mean to get zen on you, but after almost 40 years in this field, I've come to realize that the more I know, the less I really know. The more I learn, the less I know. I can tell you, tooth and nail details of certain cases, give you my best take on what my conclusions are and why. But can I prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? No. Many people report having beatific, very positive experiences with these other intelligences, and I've no reason to doubt them. Other people, again, report very frightening ones, and variations in between. I have a dear friend who is also happens to be the director of Michigan MUFON, named Bill Konkoletsky. And I saw Bill just recently when we spoke at a conference in Ohio together, and a month or so before that in Michigan. And Bill is a family man. He works for a university. He is a very, I think, well-adjusted, out very public about his lifelong experiences, and has written a wonderfully down-to-earth book about it. And what distinguishes it from most other books that I've read written by individuals who claim to have these experiences is that he talks very openly about experiences that he and his brother had growing up that were both positive, if you will, and disturbing or anxiety-provoking. What governs this? Well, my first thought would be that we're dealing with a variety of thems. I think it's naive to think that if we're not alone in the universe, there's only one other intelligence out there. The odds are that there are lots of civilizations and groups of other beings who come and go from this planet with impunity for reasons we can deduce or take our best guesses at. Some who genuinely may be concerned with our evolution, our development, the spiritual as well as in terms of our behavior. Others who may not mean us well or who don't really care about whether or not we survive and evolve through our own madness and violence. There's also another thing, which is based on the way that you were brought up and your background. Are you the kind of person that is open to change, rolls with the punches, can accept something that you hadn't even thought of as real that happens to you or that you observe or that you learn about? Or are you fairly tightly wound and anything that pulls you out of your comfort zone is frightening? I think both of these factors are in play, that the experiences that people have are informed by the intention and the behavior of these other intelligences, and equally, very likely, informed by our own psychology and reactions. I don't know about you, but even after so many years of study, of spending time with individuals who have had these kinds of experiences, the first being, I should say, my late sister Helen, who was the one who completely opened me up to this subject, and people say their lives changed overnight. Mine changed in about 90 seconds when she first told me about her experiences. I just completely lost my train of thought there in that sentence.
That's okay. You're talking about people's experiences, and then you...
Yeah, okay, yeah. I don't know about you, but even being as book knowledgeable, let's say, on this subject and research knowledgeable, and fully accepting that these things happen, if I woke up one night and I saw a glow in the room and I couldn't move, and I saw these small beings with large heads hovering around the edge of my bed, and I started to rise off the bed, I think I would, as we used to say in the 60s, freak out. I would not say, oh,
we still
well, there
say
you
that
go.
today.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good. Oh, okay, well, it's happening to me now. This is going to be interesting. Who knows how I would react, but I think I would not be immediately taking the welcome the Space Brothers point of view and can't wait to be on board and have you examine me on the table. And yet I've met many people, some with almost a mystical longing, to have these kinds of experiences, who envy those who have, when in fact that has not, in many cases, been enjoyable for these people. And then you factor in the ridicule factor. If you have had this kind of experience, for many people, and it's embodied in the title of one of David Jacobs' better-known books, which is Secret Life, most people don't broadcast this to the people that they know. In fact, they live with a certain amount of anxiety that others will find out about it, and when they do, because they won't know how to deal with it or how to react, they'll simply, poke fun or, get weird around them. And that's very uncomfortable, and nobody likes that feeling. And ridicule is a part of this and has been since 1947. So in a sense, you'd be doubly damned. You've had this experience, which in the case of somebody who lives with the anxiety of it, did not ask for it, does not like it, is frightened, and then you go forward and you have the courage to make your experiences public, then you have human beings making fun of you for it, which is, in a perfect world, absolutely outrageous and completely inappropriate.
Now, have you ever talked to people that say they were abducted, and not only did they see extraterrestrials, but also military people or just, humans?
Well, humanoid. In fact, I'm proud to say that I am an associate producer on a terrific documentary that came out last year about the very well-known individual Travis Walton, who had a rather unique experience more than 40 years ago, just over, where he was taken and returned 5 days later. And the case received international attention because he was a young logger in rural Arizona at the time, and his buddies saw him being hit by a beam of light and knocked unconscious. They felt dead, and he was gone for 5 days, and they agonized over what to do, and they went to law enforcement and they told the truth. And given the options of law enforcement in Heber, Arizona, a great little town, they were under suspicion of murder. And so this case went around the world before the 5 days was over, and he was returned from the craft that he had been in. And by then, the little town where he lived, Snowflake, Arizona, population 5,000, almost all Mormon, was alive with reporters from around the world. The poor guy was hounded for years, always took the high road, and has emerged as one of our most distinguished spokespeople. And I would encourage anybody that is interested to see the documentary film Travis, the true story of Travis Walton. The reason I bring it up is because he basically just kept going throughout the ridicule that was thrown at him for decades. And we now have the scientific evidence to back up his claims and those of the individuals that witnessed it to such a degree that you could bring it into a court of law and established, I think in no uncertain terms, that what he maintained had happened had indeed happened. And when he was on board, and this is really the point, he observed two distinct types of beings. Those that were more like the archetypical gray beings, and again, to say extraterrestrial alien is possibly true, but still speculative. I fall back on the term other intelligences for lack of anything better. And then humanoids, so-called Nordics, who resemble us to the greatest degree imaginable. But whether there is this whole subculture that maintains that the military is mimicking abductions to, well, the theory that is most popular is from folks who maintain that all aliens are good, and that the military is the one who is inflicting anxiety and pain and fear into the picture to give the other intelligences a bad name, to set up a scenario where we will see them as the enemy, etc. But military abductions may occur, and there are super specialists in the work that would be much better to comment on that than I am. But yeah, you hear everything. You hear everything over the years if you're in the work long enough.
And with your research, what have you found on implants?
Implants, of course, are very small devices, some of them the size of a BB or a grain of rice, that are either subcutaneously implanted under the skin without any discernible mark as a rule, and sometimes appear in places where realistically one wonders how they could have gotten there. The most dramatic I will never forget was an x-ray of one of the individuals Bud and I were working with, of something about the size of a BB, completely round and completely anomalous and completely inert, in other words, not giving any irritation, as these things, one of their things is, the body doesn't seem to recognize that they are in there, where if it was an actual BB or a grain of rice or a splinter, your white blood cells would rush to the rescue and you'd get an infection and you'd know it. But it was in someone's brain, an inch or two down from the top and off to the right or left, and there it was. Linda, in the Linda case, had a rather complex one way up in her nasal cavity, so far up that it would have had to have been done surgically. Nobody could have done it just by sticking something up there. And she had decided to have it removed after seeing it in an x-ray, and woke up the morning of the procedure with a little blood on her pillow to find that it had in fact been removed during the night and not by any of us. The implants, one of our real pioneer researchers in implant was a wonderful guy, a podiatric surgeon named Roger Lear, who we lost a few years back. Roger removed quite a number of implants, and one of his contributions to our knowledge of them is that they seem to be covered with an incredibly tough membrane that makes them stealth to the body, hence why they are not recognized as such. Why are they there? Well, there's only a limited number of reasons that they can be, and informed speculation would say they are there for monitoring, like being able to listen in on what's going on with this person, possibly to control, or both, or some other aspect. Let's also remember that we, human beings, and I've followed this story for almost 25 years now, have created our own, I think quite similar, implants. And the first reference I remember was over 20 years ago. A company working with agricultural interests had developed something about the size of a quarter that could be inserted in a simple procedure into a cow's ear after anesthetizing it. And it had a limited range of, I think, less than a mile or so, but if your cow wandered off, you could literally track them down. Now we are seeing a much more 1984 development in this story for some years, namely the focus being on law enforcement, corrections, and extremely wealthy people. That if somebody is a felon, make up whatever rules that you want, and has committed this crime and that crime, let's put an implant in them so that if they escape, we'll be able to find them, like a LoJack. Or if you are, a one-percenter and you're concerned that one of your children may be kidnapped and held for ransom or something, do the same with your kid. I can understand why some folks might favor this idea, but once it starts to happen, we are in Brave New World territory even more than we are right now. But make no mistake about it, implants exist in both the conventional human realm and in the truly anomalous realm as well.
Oh, yeah. I remember back in, I think it was 2000, when I saw this commercial from IBM during the football season, and it showed this guy going into a grocery store and putting a bunch of groceries in his jacket, and then he's walking out, and this guy stops him, and he goes, "Here's your receipt, sir." And I'm like, "No, it's the mark of the beast," and I was just like, and I was kind of at the time, it was a little bit of a different spot back then when I saw it, but I've known about that kind of stuff for a lot of years now. And when this company came out called Digital Angel, they actually offered a rice-sized chip that's implanted into the hand, and you can just swipe it across. So I think a more efficient way, if you're really wanting to be that lazy, or if you're that nervous about stuff too, you could kind of put a ring on your finger or something, not have to directly implant it. But hey,
I agree with you, Rex. And if you think about the change in the way that we see our privacy over the last generation or so, most of us value our privacy and don't want it violated. If you are a public person, you may choose to make certain things about yourself public. Those of us who are, slightly higher visibility in this field, like myself, I keep in touch with people who follow my work or want to know when I'll be doing my next radio show or publishing my next book or giving my next talk. I post it on my Facebook page, send it out to my list, etc. But there is now a generation of people who kind of, the selfie people. I want everybody to know everything about me and be famous in my own mind for being me. So I don't care what anybody knows about me. And oh my gosh, the chance to have an implant, that would be so futuristic and cool. And make no mistake about it, in a decade or less, there will be people that are doing this with great pleasure and voluntarily, because it means they can just swipe their hand and all their credit card information is in there. And if they're hit by a car and taken to the hospital, they can just scan it and all their medical information is in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very double-edged sword, but I like your idea better of something external, a ring or what have you, that might have that same information on it, because once it starts happening, governments change, and a seeming democracy can mutate into a fascist state, and next thing you know, it's the law. everybody's got to have one of these things, and good luck to you if you don't.
Certainly.
I mean, that's just a dystopic sort of bad fantasy right now, but it could be around the corner. And it's very important that people think these things through as these issues come up. This is not a joke. It is serious. This technology is very much with us, from us as well as from them.
Well, I mean, I saw these chips recently that are actually, they're several years old, but they're 0.05 millimeters. I mean, they're just absolutely tiny, and what they can track and do is incredible. And then you've got nanotech now that's just even more mind-blowing, that you wouldn't even know if they implanted it into your food or the atmosphere or water. And, we could go on and on about that. But Wilhelm Reich is somebody that's just an incredible person and way ahead of his time. Most people maybe don't even know who he is and what he did, but I know you're very well versed with Mr. Reich. And what can you tell our listeners here at Leak Project about him, and give us the scoop?
How many weeks do we have?
Well, how many weeks do you got?
Well, you're referring to Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who was certainly, for me, one of the greatest and most important scientific minds of the last 1,000 years, whose reputation was so thoroughly trashed by those who wanted him dead, felt threatened by his discoveries and findings, that he's kind of a footnote now. And almost anybody that I've met who claims to know something about Dr. Reich and his work has never read a single thing that he has written. And I believe there are well over 20 books in print right now. The Reich Trust, the estate, continues to go through his unpublished work, and every 2 years or so now, every few years, another book comes out. But in his lifetime, he wrote some of what I feel are some of the most important books ever written. Dr. Reich was born in 1897 in what was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and became a physician in the early 1920s, and was drawn to Vienna, where he studied, because he was fascinated by the work of the then radical mental health professional Sigmund Freud. He was invited to become part of Freud's inner circle, and for about 6 years worked extremely closely with Freud and in the Freudian method. By 1929, they had a parting of the ways. Freud had felt, and was quite adamant about it before he was Sigmund Freud, the internationally famous psychoanalyst, but a young Dr. Freud, that the libido, the sexual energy, could likely be measured if we could develop the laboratory conditions to do it, and that energy had a great deal to do with our full psychological equilibrium. In 1929, Dr. Reich presented to him, based on all of the individuals that he had worked with, that where Freud had felt that many, if not most, human neuroses, dysfunctions were rooted in what Reich termed a meaningful sexual equilibrium, the ability to come to full orgasm, to allow yourself to love, to be vulnerable, to have a full reflex, go unconscious, come back, that it was at the root of all human suffering. And that was a bit too much for Freud and the Freudians. Reich went off on his own, worked in Europe for some time, was able to escape before the doors closed by Hitler in 1933, worked in Norway for some years, and then emigrated to this country in 1940 thereabouts, where he established a practice in Queens, New York, and taught at the New School for Social Research. The science that Reich pioneered, which he called orgonomy, is simply the science of how energy functions in the living and non-living realm. I consider myself very fortunate that I was first introduced to his work when I was a teenager, and I know it's had a great deal to do with my coming to my best full potential in life, and becoming the person I became. For about 7 years, I was in the therapy that he designed with a man named Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who had been Reich's first assistant for the last 11 years of his life. He died in 1957. And the energy that he refers to is the sea of energy in which we live that animates everything. A Victorian might have called it the ether. Hindu texts might refer to it as the prana, but it's the energy. And it can be used. It can be focused. It can be concentrated. It can be measured in laboratory situations. Even Albert Einstein conceded that point after observing Reich's demonstrations and then repeating them on his own after their meeting in Princeton, New Jersey in 40 or 41. But the potential for, how can I say, the threat of folks having to face their deepest lonelinesses, their darkest fears, their most profound sadnesses by saying, well, gee, I really don't have a happy, meaningful sex life, and I'm jealous of people that do. And if what Dr. Reich says is true, then, I'm even more miserable. Therefore, I have to go out of my way to disprove it, or to reject it, or to attack him. And the attacks came, they multiplied. History of the attacks is like a Greek tragedy unto itself. Some people refer to his energy concentration device as an Orgone box, which is really a disrespectful term. It's an Orgone energy accumulator, and it is made out of layers of organic and inorganic material. Its strength is based on the number of layers. I built a small one many years ago that I used for seed germination and small experiments on my own. But as recently as last month, I was using one during a wonderful visit to Greece, where I presented 2 papers at a Wilhelm Reich conference in Athens. I speak at Reich conferences around the world, and not with the regularity I do UFO conferences, but they work. They're real. And the FDA in the 40s got wind of his work, just knew, in quotes, that he was some kind of sex quack because he talked about sex, and a quack because this machine couldn't work. It didn't plug into anything. It had no moving parts. Not that they attempted to replicate any of the experiments or actually use it, with any of their employees. They just knew. And after 9 years of trying to find a way to destroy this man and his work, which was a problem, no person who had ever seen him as a therapist or worked with him as a scientist or knew him personally, nor any of the physician psychiatrists that he trained ever complained to anyone. However, the FDA was able to, and it's not a wrong thing, to set up an injunction saying that it is an experimental medical device, which I guess by some definitions it would be, and as such could not be shipped across state lines. And in 1955, one of the physicians working with him did just that, unfortunately. They sent the panels for an accumulator from Maine to New York, and Reich decided that rather than put the responsibility on the physician, he would take responsibility and use that court opportunity as a chance to present his work. And it was possibly the worst decision of his life. He lost the case, was sent to prison for a year, and was found dead in his cell about 7 to 10 days before he was scheduled for release on parole. For many people who do admire and respect his work and who are involved in it, there is an understandable reflex to say, well, he was probably murdered. He may have been, but Dr. Reich was a chain smoker, had high blood pressure, a number of physical aspects, plus kind of a type A character, very driven, and living for freedom. He was all about love in terms of understanding it at the deepest physiological basis, freedom, children growing up in perfectly situations where their joy would not be hampered, where their own sexual experimentation among themselves would not be intruded upon by adults, and that they could establish their own sexual reality, identity, being on their own without prurient or pornographic interest. He had to die as far as some people were concerned, and I think the cause of death could have easily been a broken heart. I mean, he went from living an amazingly courageous life with tremendous contact with nature to being held in a stone and steel building, and it may have broken him. that is the tiniest introduction I can give to Dr. Reich and his work. However, for anybody interested in knowing a bit more, I think I have a number of my lectures on Reich and UFOs out there. They can probably be found on YouTube. And if you are interested in Dr. Reich's work, locate and read his books rather than reading about him, although there certainly are a handful of good books about him.
Absolutely. The way that if you go to even Wikipedia now, the stuff that's written about him, there's not a good, they've definitely tried to paint a very odd picture about him. And
well, exactly. He was an outsider. He was eccentric. He was delusional. The fact was, by way of example, one of his greatest apparatuses that he ever created was something called the Cloudbuster. And
oh, yeah.
If these apparatuses were in use in desert regions around the world, they would be shrinking every single year. Now, that sounds like some kind of, what-if pipe dream, but it's true. They work, and they work on an extremely simple principle, that a series of long metal rods, hollow, connected up to empty lengths of industrial BX cable that are grounded in a well or moving water or even a pond will create an attractor influence in the atmosphere and get energy to move toward it, creating movement in the atmosphere. If right now my part of the country, central New York State, is in something of a drought, if I had the wherewithal to build and manufacture one of these right now, the time to devote to it properly, I could be drawing moist air from the eastern direction, the Atlantic Ocean, over this part of the state and creating a higher and higher humidity index and ultimately have it result in rain. This is not theoretical. Reich broke every weather record imaginable in the field tests that he did in the Tucson, Arizona area in 1954 and 5, I recall. And among other people, Dr. James DeMeo, a remarkably courageous scientist who works out of a laboratory called the Orgone Biophysical Research Laboratory. I think you can Google it as OBRL. It's also referred to as Green Springs. And it's just outside of beautiful Ashland, Oregon. Jim has probably conducted more cloud-busting operations than anyone ever, including Reich, and has broken droughts in a number of countries over the years, often being hired by those governments. And in literally every case, even when he broke the drought, even when this should have been the biggest news in the world, he was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement because the ridicule factor associated with Dr. Reich's work is about as powerful still as the whole UFO phenomena itself. But here's the thing. In some of his weather operations, they attracted UFOs over the area repeatedly, multiply witnessed, fully documented, observed, and duly noted in the scientific method. And of course, that sounds so crazy that why even bother to confirm it for yourself? It's much easier to dismiss these things as, the quote-unquote observations of a delusional person who may have been supported by people who believed him but, thought they saw UFOs too, as they say. It's an incredible story. It's infuriating the way it worked out. But if we manage to not blow ourselves to hell over the next 100 years or so, and men of science, women of science actually begin to study Dr. Reich's amazing, amazing archive of work and the proofs and the validity of all of it, who knows, perhaps this will be the technology of the future. I will also say before we move on that years ago, I was invited to witness a demonstration of a cloudbuster. And this was probably about 10 years into my passionate interest in Dr. Reich and his discoveries and life. And I had read full scientific reports of cloud-busting operations, day-to-day, humidity index and rainfall and all that stuff. But it's one thing to intellectually accept something. It's another thing to see it happen. And the operator, who was a friend of mine and had trained to do this work in the most responsible way possible, was working with a cloudbuster that was trailer-mounted and working with a long cable, because when they're in use, they do give out a certain amount of immediate toxicity in the area. And And he was simply saying, again, this is a demonstration, but if you observe that cumulus cloud bank to the northeast, I'm going to cut that in half. And it didn't take an hour or a week. We saw it start to happen within a minute and a half, 2 minutes of the cloudbuster being trained on it. I'm going to remove this cloud bank over here. I'm going to create clouds over here, et cetera, et cetera. And absolutely in every case it did it. Life-changing day for me.
I remember actually doing some research. I'm so glad that we got into this discussion. This is just like manna from heaven right here, because
it's very important stuff, Rex.
And a lot of people don't know about it.
Yes, that's right.
Now, I've got an Orgone generator right here in front of me. I'm holding it in my hand, and it's shaped like a pyramid, and it's got the different gold and silver shavings in it. It's got a quartz crystal that's wrapped with I think a silver wire inside, and it's pretty cool. Now, I don't know how effective these things are. It's not humongous, but I've heard some good stories and done some neat research into these things. Now, the cloud busters you're talking about, I'm so glad that you reminded me on this. Maybe I'll build one of those things and present it here on the Leak Project, because I don't think they're too difficult to build at a smaller scale, and it's amazing how effective they are. It makes me think of some other stuff too. But if we could actually jump into some of some of the work that's been done here, because if you go to a website, actually orgonelab.org, you can read up on a list of the books by Mr. Reich. You've got American Odyssey,
Dr. Reich.
Dr. Reich, thank you. You've got American Odyssey, Beyond Psychology, and I could go on here. But let's talk about what Orgone is, how it works, the principles, and how effective this stuff really is.
Okay. Number one, the Orgone energy generator that you refer to, the pyramid-shaped one, I began seeing these appear a few years ago. I have not worked with one, but I am circumspect. They use the term Orgone energy, but nothing about them has anything to do with any of the scientific principles that Reich laid out. So I would
thank
take
you
those
so
with
much
a grain
for bringing
of salt
that up.
No, it's very important that you do, and they may actually do it. I'm not the end-all source of information here. I continue to learn, and in fact, one of the wonderful things about being part of this conference in Athens last month was some of my dear friends and colleagues in Greece, who are doing the work, filling me in on particulars and details. Also, yes, a cloudbuster is not difficult to build. All the more reason that it concerns me that anybody can build one and then create a certain amount of weather, havoc, and mayhem with it. And make no mistake, that is a very real possibility. I would say for anyone with an interest in even considering doing it, hold off before you read at least some of Reich's basic important writings. And I don't have the time to take months to read books. Well, if you're going to consider messing around with the very energy in the atmosphere, you owe it to all of us to do just that. I would read, among other things, Character Analysis, Ether, God, and Devil, People in Trouble, Genitality. I could send you. Well, I should send you a list. The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Take it in and consider what you are considering doing. And if anybody just decides to do it anyway, remember, especially for men who are testosterone-fueled and, wow, oh my gosh, I can change the sky. This is so cool. I am so hip. That is not the attitude. One needs to work with patience, humility. It can take weeks of constant work every day, elevating ever so slightly your pipes to bring that moisture-rich atmosphere over your area. And if you want to just screw around with it, I am aware of several cases, including one I'm most aware of some years ago in the northwestern part of the United States, where a very responsible operator was involved in trying to break a drought. And based on their long experience, what should have been happening was not. And in fact, a certain amount of unpredicted, really destructive storms were the result. they ultimately found out that somebody without any experience or any background or any respect for the technology had built a cloudbuster 50 miles away and was having a good time with it. And the results were very bad. Just a word to the wise there.
So it's not like going out and barbecuing a couple of steaks and be like, hey, guys, come on over. We just want to have a good time, man. Just a few fireworks.
Can do it, even if you're not a good cook. Well said. Yes, it's not like that. I would also say you can visit the website of the Orgone Biophysical Research Lab and read the results of cloud-busting operations. There is also an organization called the American College of Orgonomy, just outside of Princeton, New Jersey, that maintains an archive of information on this, although I don't believe that they have been involved in weather modification for some time. And then there is Reich's final book, a book called Contact with Space, which, interestingly, the conference in Greece was named after because Reich's UFO-related work was our focus, and a very courageous conference it was, and I'm very excited that for a first conference, which can be very risky and, you lose money and things, we were all so impressed and so moved by how it went that we are going to move heaven and earth to make it an annual event. Obviously, a lot of folks can't just take the time out and, buy a round-trip ticket to Greece, but it will happen next summer, and it will happen the summer after, and I will be loud and clear and encouraging everyone that can to attend it. But Reich's final book, Contact with Space, was posthumously printed a month after he died, that being in December of 1957, and only 500 copies were ever printed. When I first got into the work, I now look back and say, $75, $100, I can't spend that money on a book. But go online now and see if you can find a copy for less than $1,000. However, I am glad to report that for any serious students of the work, you can buy a very good Xerox-bound copy of the book from the bookstore at the Wilhelm Reich Museum in Rangeley, Maine. And it's about $50. However, I would also say, if you're new to the work, it's probably not, it is definitely not the book to introduce Reich's work to you. It is the natural extension of more than 35 years of hard work in the scientific method, brilliant discoveries, extraordinary observations, and you should do some reading before you do that. Nonetheless, it is a brilliant scientific book on the cloud-busting discovery in the early 1950s, the initial work in the state of Maine, the specifics of what they observed, the earliest UFO incursions, and then a point-by-point review of the major field tests that happened in Arizona the following year, which should be of interest to anyone with or without a scientific background if this general subject intrigues them. But I would do some basic reading in Reich before reading Contact with Space. Okay.
And I want to talk more about the real Orgone generators here in a minute, but first I'd recommend our listeners go to Peter Robbins, NY.com, peterrobbinsny.com, that's 2 B's. And I mean, it's just a variety of information here. You've got multiple interviews, videos, you've got your publications, a blog, and I think that this is great. Also some good pictures as well. Now, one of the things...
Well, thanks, Rex, although I'm a little embarrassed to say it's been up for months now, my latest website, and I have been so lax in posting. It's actually embarrassing, but I will get on the case as we move into the year more and bring it up to date, but thank you very much for that. And one book that I would suggest anybody with an interest in experiencing what Reich called the Orgone, the energy that we take for granted as we go through every day, consider buying a very modestly priced book called the Orgone Energy Accumulator Handbook by Dr. James DeMeo. There's an updated edition, and that is something that I would encourage anyone to consider building for a couple $100 worth of material or even less, and with some basic carpentry skills. If not, you can have things pre-cut, and if you have some bucks, have somebody assemble it for you. You can put together one that's large enough to sit in, and you will experience an energetic charge that can become a part of your daily life. I should have one here. In fact, it is on my list of things to do. I've used them on and off for decades. And again, it was wonderful staying in a home last month outside of Athens where my friend Jenny has one. And it was great to put it to use again.
Yeah, those things sound neat. And I guess, like you said, if you got the schematics, why not? Just do it. That sounds like a great opportunity.
That is something that I would encourage anyone to do, as opposed to build a cloud buster where that is something else. But an Orgone energy accumulator, again, it's what Reich observed was that organic material will hold energy. Inorganic material will reflect energy. And so these devices, very simple, are made up of alternating layers of organic and inorganic material. Classic materials would be sheet metal and plywood, or steel wool and cotton. And depending on how many, and you could make, speaking about like steel wool and cotton, the OBRL sells a number of accumulator products, which you can also make, namely an Orgone energy accumulator blanket or a pad. That is something that anybody can make. Let's say a 6-ply or a 10-ply steel wool and cotton mat, in a cotton cover that, if you have a burn, will speed up the healing of the burn. If you have a sore throat, say holding it against your throat for 10 minutes twice a day or something, you can figure out your own regime. Again, when I built a small accumulator years ago, I used it for my own experimentation and for seed germination tests, having a control box the exact same size and scale, and the plants grown from the seeds that had spent time in the accumulator always grew faster, more fully, and seemed to overall be healthier for their lifespan than the control sample seeds that I would always conduct as well. And one of the exciting things, in a way, is that you have an opportunity as a layperson to replicate experiments that he did and see for yourself, more important, experience for yourself how this works. It's all about energy. And the basic approach of the therapy was with the understanding that we carry around in our bodies contractions that become chronic, some of them from disappointments, some of them from physical problems, that we begin to restrict our breathing even without realizing it, that we settle into a state of resignation. Who's ever really happy? This is the way life is, and I'm going to just settle for this, and, I'm not going to look for too much. I'm not going to look to fall in love because that it never works out and it's just going to make me sad again. There are people who live their lives in resignation and don't expect much from life, and those of us who are always out there, looking to make whatever we can the best it can be, live the fullest lives we can, have courage to live, to love, to be of goodwill, to leave the world a little better than we find it, and to fight the good fight, what it all comes down to. And in this world that we have today, there's very little more important that you can still instill in people than to follow that path.
Yeah, hey, those are some great words. And just one question more before we close out tonight, and certainly I really appreciate you coming on here with this Leak Project, and I know that our listeners will as well. Now, I think I heard you say towards the beginning that you did work or therapy, Reich therapy, for 11 years?
No, I was a patient of Reich's first assistant, Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, a remarkable psychotherapist, now long gone, for about 7 years. And briefly, Reich had trained in the Freudian method, which is staying in your head, all talk. And let me also differentiate, because there are probably thousands and thousands of people that call themselves Reichian therapists. All well and good, and I'm sure many of them, some of them do very good work. However, to qualify to hang out your shingle as a Reichian therapist, I think the qualifications are touch your finger to your nose, turn around 3 times, and declare that you are, and you are. Medical orgonomists, and there are only a few dozen in the world right now, probably always have been, no more than that, unfortunately, are physicians who then become psychiatrists, who then go through X number of extra years under the observation originally of Reich or Baker, and now of a senior orgonomist, to practice in the method that Reich pioneered, which involves a certain amount of talk, but it is really all based on very physical therapy, where you are in there kicking and pounding and screaming when necessary. And the result of this is bringing up certain memories that are at the core of some tremendous disappointments, sadnesses, physiological contractions, which, if they are allowed to come to the surface, that can then be addressed in catharsis, and that muscular contraction that was being held in place for years, if not decades, will in fact dissolve and give you greater mobility, greater energy, I'd say as a byproduct, more courage to live a healthy, happy life. There is a book written by an actor who is not very well known right now, Orson Bean. I think it was published in the 60s or 70s, about his therapy with Dr. Baker. It's a used book that probably you can find for a couple of bucks online, called Me and the Orgone. And in it, it's a very non-scientific, very a pleasant book, but a tough book in a way, about his therapy with Dr. Baker. And again, it's not going into the scientific particulars. It is going into his experience of it and what he benefited from it. It's as good an introduction to medical orgone therapy as any that I've ever read, especially for a layperson.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been great, Peter. Once again, I really appreciate you coming on here with the Leak Project. Folks, check out peterrobbinsny.com, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to speak with you again sometime.
Let's make that opportunity. I'd be glad to return to the show, Rex.
Fantastic. Folks, also go to leakproject.com. If you haven't already become a member at Leak Project, it's free. It's easy to do. Just set yourself up a profile there. You'll have access to exclusive content and exclusive deals, and be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Talk to you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and we have guest Peter Robbins with us today from peterrobbinsny.com. Now, Peter is an investigative writer, author, and lecturer, best known for his information on UFO'S and Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Now, during this discussion, not only do we discuss the research that Peter has put together over the past 35 years on the UFO phenomenon, but also during the second half of the show, we dive into Dr. Wilhelm Reich, his work, the Orgone energy accumulators that he built and was ridiculed for by Big Pharma and many large corporations and top scientists because they were afraid it was going to take away what they had built, essentially, because these things were so powerful. And also, we talk about these cloud busters that Dr. Reich used to put together that has some pretty powerful consequences on the environment. So some pretty good stuff. I would recommend listening to the entire presentation. If you want to know more about the Orgone energy accumulators and the cloud busters, definitely listen to the second half of the show. During the first half, we discuss his work with the United Nations. He worked with the House of Parliaments in the UK. So he's had some pretty prestigious positions, and he definitely knows his stuff. Over 30 years of research into the field of UFOs and Dr. Wilhelm Reich. So this is a good presentation. I hope you enjoy the show. Make sure to subscribe to youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. We also have a new YouTube channel. It's the William Wallace YouTube channel. So, I actually was doing some research, and I noticed that you've actually worked with the UN before.
Well, yes, indirectly. In fact, my very first, I'll call it a job, even though it was unpaid, and this goes back more than 35 years. I was several years into the work, and one of my mentors, long gone now, a remarkable guy who had served on the general staff of the Hungarian military during World War II, one of the world's best photo analysts at the time, Coleman von Kavetsky. He's a naturalized American citizen and had a relationship with two United Nations Secretaries General, Uthant and Kurt Waldheim. And it was under the tenure of Waldheim that the United Nations had a brief, open discussion on whether or not they should make the subject of UFOs a permanent study issue as an aspect of General Assembly. And he had invited myself and my earliest contemporary colleague in the field, Antonio Huneeus, to work on editing the paper that he had written for Waldheim to be presented at that historic series of meetings. And this was in November of 1978. So although it was presented at the UN, I was not working for the UN at the time. Some of my most distinguished colleagues, though, Stanton Friedman, Jacques Vallée, Dr. Alan Hynek, were present and were speakers at the time, as well as an extraordinarily important military witness, Lawrence Coyne, who was an Army helicopter. I'm trying to remember whether he was a pilot or an officer, but he was involved in one of the most dramatic UFO events ever documented. He presented as well, as did Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, on the reality of UFOs. Unfortunately, Cooper's statement had to be read into the record because he was not able to get to New York. The city had been kind of locked in by a blizzard the day before. But it was an amazing experience for me to sit up in the gallery and watch how the representatives chose not to deal with this subject. One had the sense, watching their faces and their reactions, that they would have rather been, called to a resolution of war rather than be compelled to go back to their leadership and say we need to take UFOs seriously. I mean, these guys valued their cushy jobs in New York and their nice apartments and good salaries, and the ridicule factor has no limits in terms of who it extends to. I should say also that the resolution was passed and then allowed to die in committee, and that was the last we've ever heard from the UN relative to this subject. Not a nice commentary.
Well, and haven't the United Nations recently appointed, I want to pronounce her name properly, Moslin Othman? She's into astrophysics from Malaysia as the ambassador for outer space affairs, essentially?
I believe so, but and one would imagine that if such a resolution were ever brought up again, or the issue of UFOs was ever to come under United Nations purview or review, that it would be his group that it would come under. As things stand right now, to the best of my knowledge, nothing relative to that subject has come up. It's much more concerned with what we'll call conventional outer space issues at this point.
So the media probably took that, and they can spin it in a numerous amount of ways. And then I'm wondering if the UN kind of did that as a PR stunt, campaign essentially to create a certain buzz with the masses?
It wouldn't surprise me. The fact is that it's a subject that is such a flashpoint for fascination and ridicule. One can imagine official bodies being pulled in both directions. And, for example, Her Majesty's government in Great Britain years ago began to declassify UFO documents, then stopped, then did it again, and I think we're going to be having a new spate of them soon. Quite a few thousand documents were, in fact, declassified. Not surprisingly, all low or mid-level documents, no smoking gun, but some interesting smoke. And it had occurred to many of us at the time that it was both a smart public relations move, that if there was some real sincerity behind it, it was, step number one in laying out some background material for those interested who, might want to learn a little more. Again, it stops at a very specific level. But as far as I'm concerned, anything is better than nothing. So good for Great Britain on that.
And then also, if you go to, there's FBI.gov, it's vault.fbi.gov, You can actually pull up, I guess, some of those papers you're referring to, or a few of them anyway, some referring to the Roswell incident in 1950. A gentleman by the name, or I guess his code name was Guy Hotel or Hostel or something like that. And he
no code name. That was his real name. He was a special agent in charge. I'm trying to remember whether it was in Washington or not. Many people think that particular series of cables are fake or in some way not authentic. In fact, they are. If you've read them, you know that they read like some exciting science fiction script excerpt. And they were actually declassified before we had a Freedom of Information Act in this country, which came in under President Carter. In fact, the way that it had worked, I don't know how it is anymore, that documents that had been considered classified would be reviewed every 3 years, and after a 12-year cycle, if they were considered not crucial to the security of the United States, they would be quietly declassified and placed appropriately in the National Archives, where in some cases they were discovered by researchers and investigators. I think they're terribly important. They're a remarkably significant footnote to post-war history, and yet, unless you're really into the subject, folks don't even know they exist.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I'm reading the article right now, and I'm at the office memorandum, and it's from 1950, and it says that he saw 3 beings in each craft. They were about 3 feet tall, and they had like a metallic cloth of fine texture. Now, I've heard different theories about this. I've heard the theory that they were prisoners of war, and they were actually being used as some type of experiment. And
I've certainly heard that as well. And again, Hottel is reporting what a witness saw. He is not saying, I saw this. But having studied Roswell fairly extensively, not to the degree that some of my very specialist research colleagues have, but also having the privilege of working as a consultant to the city of Roswell for more than 2 years, and acting as their liaison at the time between the mayor's office and Governor Richardson's office on matters that were related to UFOs. I educated myself that much more to the subject. I think ultimately, if you can't present, a carburetor from a UFO or an appendix from an alien or what have you, it's always going to be kind of a he said, she said sort of thing, and people will believe either what they want to believe or maybe more accurately what they can tolerate believing. But I am convinced that the evidence is overwhelming in support of the crash of a truly anomalous craft well outside the town limits of the town of Roswell in the summer of 1947.
Now, you've been doing research on UFOs, ETs, the paranormal for about 35 years or so, right?
A bit more, yeah. Primarily the UFO subject in general and its implications for humanity. And when I say UFO, Rex, let me just clarify. I think, like a lot of folks in the field, that many, if not most, and possibly the majority of quote-unquote UFO reports are, in fact, explainable in conventional terms. More so now even than when the phenomena kicked in, so-called modern age of UFOs began in 1947. The reason being that we human beings and first world governments have things up in our skies that are so advanced, black budget projects, that they mimic what the behavior of the truly anomalous objects, whether or not, as some maintain, that they are the result of back engineering, to use the popular phrase of crashed UFOs, remains to be seen. I used to have sort of a running discussion with my friend and another mentor, Bud Hopkins, over the years that we were colleagues, about this very subject. Bud always felt that we human beings, at our best, are capable of anything, really. And the big question is, could we have gotten from there to here on our own? There being, going back to the post-war years, the age of tube radios, pre-transistor, piston-driven machines that move things from here to here, to where we seem to be now, complete with the Internet